Okay, so picking back up with part two of this lecture, the next objective is distinguishing among compliance audits, right? And so, again, we're focused back on the internal control framework. We're focused on this slice, right? This compliance piece. I guess three-dimensionally that would be like this, right? And so the compliance audits are focused on ensuring the controls that are operating across the different divisions are meeting the goals and objectives of the firm, right? Whether that's compliance with firm policies and procedures, or it's laws and regulations, or standards, whatever it is, that is the focus of these compliance audits. Right, and so whether the firms comply with those, and the other thing, agreements, right? So it could be, for example, there's a joint venture and with another company, and we're agreeing to do certain steps of a given process, right? So we want to make sure that we're meeting the terms of that joint agreement, that joint venture agreement, or we have certain contract stipulations with our customers, and so we want to make sure that we're actually meeting those conditions of the contract, right? Because if we don't, then the firm is going to be opened up to potential lawsuits. So there are standards around different attestation engagements that could apply here. And remember, we had those three levels. Kind of the highest level is the examination, and then we have agreed upon procedures. But if we're doing a compliance audit, you can't do a review. That's the lowest level, right? And so if you want to do a compliance audit, it has to be either the examination or the agreed upon procedures. It can't be at the level of review, because review is essentially just looking at the design, right? It doesn't really get into doing a lot of testing. And so if we're talking about attesting to, so we could do agreed upon procedures for specified requirements in a given law or regulation, but then also procedures would be focused on effectiveness of internal controls, and performing the examinations is clearly the highest level, right? So that's just kind of breaking those down to the different levels we can do the attestation. And so if we have an examination, a full-on examination, and then we're going to have a report just like we have the audit opinion. And so usually it's going to say, we conducted this examination, and we'll specify in accordance with what criteria we used. And we're going to modify it if there's material non-compliance, right? To where basically, let's say it's an environmental examination, and so we're supposed to keep, the firm was supposed to keep waste below a certain level, and they did not comply with that, then that would have to be in the report. If the whatever unit that we're looking at, could be the entire firm, if there's restrictions on which part of the firm we could look at, or which, let's say we wanted to do environmental, and so then we're looking at water waste and air pollution, right? But there was some kind of restriction on our ability to do one or the other, that would have to be in the report. And then if there was another CPA firm used in the examination, then that would have to be done or included in the report as well, right? So compliance, and by the way, compliance can be done by internal auditors, but it also can be done by CPAs that are external to the firm, right? And so if these standards are largely talking about when it's a CPA firm as far as doing an examination. And so before, when I mentioned that internal auditors can be a part of compliance, they definitely can, but obviously any reports they're issuing are not going to be public, right? Whereas So these are just going to be internal reports. Oops. Oop, that's an internal. Versus if it's a CPA firm, then that report could possibly be external. Even if it may or may not necessarily be made public, it could go to an external regulator, for example. I'm going to skip over the broker-dealer reports. That's kind of a specific thing related to a certain kind of firm, and that's more detail than we really need to get into. Okay, so looking at Learning Objective 6, looking at these government auditing standards and Single Audit Act, this is essentially a type of compliance audit, right? So the thing to recognize here is that there's kind of 3 levels of standards, and and they kind of build on each other, right? So really, if I had to do this over again, I would kind of put the generally accepted auditing standards as the foundation, right? This is kind of the base, okay? And then depending on the type of firm and some other conditions, you might have to add the governmental auditing standards, or you might have to, and then you might have to add, in addition to that, the Single Audit Act requirements, okay? So, again, kind of generally accepted auditing standards, or especially if you're talking about a private company, they have to follow the opinion on financial statements. But then, if there are certain laws and regulations, so for you have like a governmental entity, or you have a like a university, for example, right, that gets government funds, then they're going to have to deal with not just the financial statement opinion, right? They have to have that as well, so that would be based on the generally accepted auditing standards, but they also have to comply with the laws and regulations and have a separate report about that, and based on the governmental auditing standards. And then if there are some additional requirements or conditions that are met, then you have to also comply with the Single Audit Act, right? So notice how it says same as GAAS. And GAS also, and so here the Single Audit Act is related to this major federal assistance programs, right? So we get a bunch of grants, right, as a university, for example, and so a lot of those grant programs have their own set of regulations, or they have another set of regulations that the university has to adhere to, and so you're basically going to have to make sure that all those requirements are met, and the internal controls to make sure those assistance programs are done correctly. We're going to have to test those as well as auditors, right? And so you're going to have the financial statement opinion, the report about compliance about laws and regulations, and you're going to have these additional reports if you meet the Single Audit Act requirement. And so, right, you have to have the schedule of expenditures of the awards, and then you have to have a summary report related to the financial statements, internal control, compliance, and then any another report related to findings and costs, right? The costs that are related to these awards. And so, if there's any issues, for example, where they were supposed to spend money, for example, on tuition assistance, right? But a university instead maybe spent money, some of those funds on, athletes, right? Just as an example. So they diverted money away from the university and gave it to the athletes, right? The athletic program. So that'd be an example of of a situation where they'd have to basically provide another report around those findings. But again, these are kind of building on each other based on do you have these conditions, right? So the base is the generally accepted auditing standards. Well, do you have some other laws and regulations that require you to meet the governmental auditing standards? And then do you have some major federal assistance programs that require you to meet the Single Audit Act, right? So it kind of adds, each additional condition adds to the audit and adds to the report. It doesn't replace what was in the lower levels. So I'm going to go through every single one of these slides, but I just want to hit a couple things. So if we're talking about generally accepted auditing standards, where does compliance fit in? Well, if laws and regulations, the violation of which has a direct and material effect on the financial statements, right, then you're required to think about compliance. Okay. For example, if there were really large environmental violations that could have a large fine or a large amount that would be required to be spent on restitution of whatever the problem was, that would be something that auditors would have to consider. And so what are the kind of things they would do, right? Obviously there would be a lot of discussion around are there any laws and regulations that are specific to the firm, reviewing any compliance requirements, grant or loan agreements, reviewing minutes, right? And basically you're going to get the managers to assert that basically a written assertion about how well they've complied with these. And so you're also going to be talking to the lawyers, right? The internal lawyers for the firm as well, the counsel, to deal with a lot of this compliance. And looking again, we're talking about governmental auditing standards, generally accepted governmental auditing standards. So where is that generally used? Federal entities, federal governmental entities, and organizations that get federal money, right? And so those are the firms that would check the box for that. The standards themselves are included in the Yellow Book. This is the name for their standards. And they're going to take effect, obviously, for these firms, assuming that the laws and regulations require it, right? Which a lot of times the laws are written, if there is federal assistance, they'll say, and you have to abide by audits have to abide by these generally accepted governmental auditing standards. Yeah, there's ethical behavior, just like there is for the CPAs in terms of doing governmental audits. And like I mentioned before, right, the report for this, still have to have the financial statement report, but now you have to have a separate written report on compliance with laws and regulations and on internal control, right? So, yeah, the summary slide says a lot, and these slides behind it are just kind of filling in the details. All right, so I'll stop right here and I'll do one more video for the rest of the lecture.